ոչինչ, խնդիր չի։ Okay, խնդիր չկա։ Շնորհակալ եմ շատ։ Սարկածդ կորել է, արի մի հատ նորից внутренний դիր, ես գործ եմ անում։
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this COPE seminar, an introduction to publication ethics. Now, this session has been especially designed to support early career editors and to help journal editors and publishers who are preparing their COPE membership application. See if this moves. Okay. So first, some housekeeping points. Now, by default, all attendees are in listen-only mode with video switched off for a better internet performance. The webinar will be recorded and the privacy policy is on the COPE website. However, the recording this time will only be used by COPE staff to analyze the audience questions anonymously in order to develop future resources. The recording will not be made available after the webinar, but instead, all attendees will be sent a link to a recording of the same webinar that we gave a few months ago. You're welcome to type questions at any time in the Q&A box, but not in the chat box. And all typed questions will be visible to everyone, and you can click on the thumbs up icon if you have a similar question, and we'll answer the ones with the most clicks first. I'm Trevor Lane. I'm a COPE trustee and council member, and I'm a consultant in publishing, education, and research impact. I'm based in Hong Kong, but calling today from the UK. My host is Anubhav Pradhan, who joins us from India. Hello, Anubhav.
Hi, Trevor. Thank you for introducing me and starting the webinar. Hello, everybody. I'm Anubhav Pradhan. I'm an assistant professor with the Department of Liberal Arts at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kariyai, in central India. I'm a COPE council member. I'm also a part of the editorial board of a journal and have been teaching and researching for the past 12 years now. Looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thanks. And we'll hear more from Anubhav later. Now, both Anubhav and I in this workshop will be talking about this COPE Ethics Toolkit and how it can be used to help potential members join COPE. But the toolkit and this webinar should also be useful for current or new COPE members to help them keep up to date with how to run an ethical journal office. Here's the rundown of the webinar. I'll introduce COPE and the Ethics Toolkit, and then I'll explain the COPE core practices and the principles of transparency and best practice in scholarly publishing. And Anubhav will then give tips on applying for COPE membership, and we'll have an anonymous interactive quiz to practice some of the principles in the interactive case studies. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. So first, an introduction to COPE. COPE, or the Committee on Publication Ethics, is a non-profit group set up in 1997, and it's run by a small team of paid staff and 30 or so volunteer trustees and council members. Although the group is a UK registered charity, there are more than 13,000 members, come from 97 countries, and they're mostly publishers and editors of scholarly journals, but also now universities and research institutes. And there are also some individual and corporate members, including editorial and publishing support services. It's important to note that we don't have legal powers, but our function is to bring together all stakeholders worldwide to discuss, develop, and promote best practices in publication ethics. And our website is in the corner, publicationethics.org.org. COPE offers many resources. A regular activity for members is the quarterly online forum to discuss publishing trends and suggest solutions to members' ethics cases. But the more than 600 case summaries are publicly available for everyone to use on the website. Other web resources are flowcharts to handle potential cases of ethical breaches, guidelines on publication ethics and discussion papers on emerging issues, and recordings of COPE speakers and members-only meetings. And COPE is a joint founder of the Principles of Transparency, which I mentioned. And for members, we have an e-learning course and a journal audit. Our formal mission is promoting integrity in scholarly research and its publication by providing practical resources to educate and support our members, providing leadership in thinking in publication ethics, and offering a neutral and unbiased professional voice in current debates. I've mentioned some of the member benefits already. If you look at the last row, you'll also see that members get a customized COPE logo that can be verified with COPE for use on their website. And members can also use template office letters, and they can be nominated and elected as council members. Now, to become a member, we recommend using the COPE Ethics Toolkit to check your journal office has clear author and reviewer guidelines and processes for identifying and handling ethical issues. The two main resources we use are the guidance of the 10 core practices and the 16 principles of transparency. For those in the audience who are already COPE members, you can do a periodic office health check using the COPE journal audit. And for established journal offices that follow COPE guidance but are not yet members, you can use the Principles of Transparency as a sort of compliance checklist before applying for membership. And although the COPE e-learning course is for members only, the introductory module is available for non-members also to take. Now, in that same infographic, there's a section for new journals that have not are preparing for their applications to COPE. And so our advice for you is to systematically use the toolkit and the relevant COPE core practices to develop your own clear and ethical author and reviewer guidelines, and to identify, prevent, and handle ethical problems. And this last box for responding to suspected ethical breaches actually uses all the other COPE core practices, including handling complaints and appeals. Following the toolkit should ensure that your journal is ready and already follows ethical best practices before applying for COPE membership, because this is something the COPE membership subcommittee will be looking for. The toolkit recommends this approach for setting up an ethical journal office and nurturing a positive publishing culture. So be transparent with all your publication procedures and link to COPE materials as needed to clearly inform authors, reviewers, and readers of the processes of submission, review, publication, and also grievances. comprehensively plan who will do what and how, to respond in a timely way to ethical breaches and allegations of misconduct, whether this is done by an ethics team or a dedicated integrity editor or member of staff, and cooperate with other journals and with institutions as needed using relevant COPE guidelines. And be prepared to protect the integrity of the published research record and amend it using COPE guidelines and flowcharts by publishing corrections, retractions, or expressions of concern, and seeking legal advice when needed. Now we turn to the two sets of guiding principles behind the toolkit as the basis for setting the guidelines and codes of conduct for your own journal. So these are the COPE core practices and the principles of transparency. So first, the 10 COPE core practices are the key routine activities and functions needed to reach the highest standards in publication ethics, and they apply as far as possible to all publication stakeholders and all COPE members of categories. The core practices are high-level roles and responsibilities that uphold publication integrity. So in alphabetical order, I'll go through them quickly, but it's good to go through them word for word because they are high-level, what we call meta guidelines. They are guidelines to help you create your own guidelines. So number one, allegations of misconduct. Journals should have a clearly described process for handling allegations. However they are brought to the journal's or publisher's attention, journals must take seriously allegations of misconduct, both pre- and post-publication, and policies should include how to handle allegations from whistleblowers. Those are people who are reporting the potential misconduct or malpractice. Number two, authorship and contributorship. Clear policies that allow for transparency around who contributed to the work and in what capacity should be in place for requirements for authorship and contributorship, as well as processes for managing potential disputes. Number three, complaints and appeals. Journals should have a clearly described process for handling complaints against the journal, its staff, editorial board, or publisher. Number four, conflicts of interest or competing interests. There must be clear definitions of conflicts of interest and processes for handling conflicts of interest of authors, reviewers, editors, journals, and publishers, whether identified before or after publication. 5, data and reproducibility. Journals should include policies on data availability and encourage the use of reporting guidelines and registration of clinical trials and other study designs according to standard practice in their discipline. 6, ethical oversight should include, but is not limited to, policies on consent to publication, publication on vulnerable populations, ethical conduct of research using animals, ethical conduct of research using human subjects, handling confidential data, and ethical business and marketing practices. 7, all policies on intellectual property or IP, including copyright and publishing licenses, should be clearly described. In addition, any costs associated with publishing should be obvious to both authors and readers, and policies should be clear on what counts as pre-publication that will preclude consideration. What constitutes plagiarism and redundant or overlapping publication should be specified. 8, journal management. A well-described and implemented infrastructure is essential, including the business model, policies, processes, and software for efficient running of an editorially independent journal, as well as the efficient management and training of editorial boards and editorial and publishing staff. 9, all peer review processes must be transparently described and well managed. Journals should provide training for editors and reviewers and have policies on diverse aspects of peer review, especially with respect to adoption of appropriate models of review and processes for handling conflicts of interest, appeals, and disputes that may arise in peer review. And 10, post-publication discussions and corrections. Journals must allow debate post-publication either on their site, through letters to the editor, or on an external moderated site such as PubPeer. They must have mechanisms for correcting, revising, or retracting articles after publication. Now, as for the principles of transparency and best practice in scholarly publishing, These are standards specifically governing how an editorial office produces high-quality publications, including special issues, supplements, and conference proceedings. Along with COPE, the co-authors of these guidelines are DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journals, WASPA, the Open Access Scholarly Publishing Association, and WAME, or WAMI, the World Association of Medical Editors. And the latest version is version 4, released in 2022. So I will be highlighting the differences between the old version from 2018 and the new version for members to keep up to date. Now, the 16 principles are arranged in areas of publication management. That's journal content, journal practices, the organization managing the journal, and business practices. So these are quite comprehensive. Some are practical, some are technical, but it's one of the criteria for COPE membership. The additions in the newest version are in yellow. And a new general point is that publishers and editors are responsible for promoting accessibility, diversity, and equity and inclusivity in all aspects of publication. And editorial decisions should be based on scholarly merit only. So that's an addition in the new version in the introduction. I would say that a common problem I've noticed for many journals that call themselves international is that it's very clear that all the editors and reviewers and even authors are just from one country or region. So beware if your journal name or your guidelines are claiming that your journal is international. There has to be an effort to make it truly international. So let's go through each of the 16 principles, but very briefly, and again, just looking at the yellow part specifically for the new sections. So number one, the name of the journal. Of course, it should be unique and not misleading. And here's a COPE member journal from Armenia as an example, and it's called Wisdom. So I'll be using some examples from COPE members. Number two, now again, the yellow highlight means a new item. So current COPE members or reapplicants should update their own guidelines according to the yellow highlights. Number two is that websites should be secure and use HTTPS in the web address, and the website content should not be misleading or plagiarized. There should be clear aims and scope statement and authorship criteria and separate ISSNs or international standard serial numbers for the print and electronic versions. The publishing frequency should be clear and accurate. So if you say you publish 4 times a year, we'll be testing that and looking at the publishing frequency. And there should be a permanent online archive of the journal's articles. In case the website gets deleted, the content, the articles are still there in the internet in, for example, websites of PubMed Central or PMC, LOCKSS, CLOCKSS, Portico, or PKP Preservation Network. Who owns the copyright should be clear, and the website and journal copyright notices should be separate, such as in this example from a Wiley journal. So Wiley is the publisher, but the journal is owned by a professional society and a university. A technical but important point is to show copyright and open access license, such as Creative Commons or CC license, in both the PDF and the HTML versions of articles. Principle 7 on publication ethics refers to 8 of the 10 COPE core practices, showing that the principles of transparency and the COPE core practices do complement each other. The other 2 COPE core practices appear in the other principles of transparency. And please note that ethics statements in the journal's website won't usually just be one long list to cover these bullet points. They'll actually appear in multiple places. For example, policies on conflicts of interest may appear in the general statement, and then in it should be repeated for specific people in relevant personalized guidelines, for example, for the authors, for the editors, and for the reviewers. And only COPE members can show their COPE member logo while explaining their ethics policies in their websites. So non-members shouldn't be using the logo and shouldn't be claiming that they're members. Number 7, continued. Journals need to detect and prevent misconduct such as plagiarism, citation manipulation, and data manipulation. And both COPE members and non-members are very welcome to link to COPE's core practices and COPE's resources, such as flowcharts, as your own guidelines for dealing with suspected ethical breaches. But don't just copy and paste our information. Number 8, the principle on peer review is about clarity of the process, including new requirements in yellow on saying who conducts review and if author recommended reviewers are allowed or not, and if individuals are anonymized, and if peer review reports are published with or without reviewer names. Peer review continued. Some more new requirements in yellow stating that the decision-making process is, and clarifying exceptions to a regular peer review process. So there are some times where the model of peer review might be overridden by another model, or for example, if the editor-in-chief has a conflict of interest with the submission. So clarify exceptions to the regular peer review process, such as which article types don't get peer reviewed, and stating the publication date and in the final article. So this is something new that all journals should be doing, preferably also with the dates of manuscript receipt and manuscript acceptance. Number 9, journals need to clearly say how readers can access the articles and what the prices are if there are any fees. Number 10, journal ownership and management must be clear, ideally with relevant web links. And to not look like a fake or predatory journal, number 11, of course, the editorial board needs to be true and real, showing their names and affiliations, and keep the editorial board up to date and show clear journal contact details. If you become a COPE member, it's important to please keep COPE informed of personnel team changes, especially if the chief editor changes. Number 13, again, author fees and any waivers or discounts must be transparent and independent of editorial decisions. And number 14, all revenue sources such as supplements and read and publish deals should be stated in the guidelines and ideally also in the articles, and again must not influence editorial decisions. Finally, 15, journals should state if they accept advertising and under what conditions. And number 16, direct marketing or emailing campaigns should be done professionally and honestly. So please do avoid sending out spam. So COPE journal and publisher members need to follow both the 10 COPE core practices, which deal with general publishing ethics, and the 16 principles of transparency, which focus on producing peer-reviewed publications. And as we've seen, both sets of principles are harmonized with each other. So please use both sets of guidelines to develop your own journal's ethics policies and procedures. Next, we'll spend about 10 minutes going over some guidance on applying for COPE membership. And now I've been on COPE Council for more than 7 years, and in my first term, in the first 3 years, I was on the membership subcommittee assessing applications from journals and publishers. So Anubhav, I know that you are currently a member of the membership subcommittee, and so you've got first-hand recent experience processing applications.
Yeah, I've been part of membership subcommittee ever since I joined COPE Council in 2021, and it's been a very interesting and perhaps even challenging experience.
Great. So you're the perfect person to give some advice. Now, the first question I have for you is, can you tell us how the COPE core practices from the toolkit are relevant to running a journal office?
Right. Thank you. I think that's a very important question for all the participants who joined us today. As you've already said, the core practices and the principles of transparency are really harmonized with each other. And what COPE is looking to do is to actually encourage potential members as well as existing members to sort of not just copy paste, whatever we spoke out on our website, but sort of adapt all of these core practices and the principles of transparency to your context, without, of course, losing sight of the essence of what we are trying to do. The essence of what we are trying to do is to engender a culture of ethics and inclusivity in academic research and publishing. We have around 4 of these on the slide right now. I quickly, for example, give you some examples of how, for example, we do this in our journey. I'm by discipline a South Asianist. I belong to South. I'm located in South Asia. Journal management is something that both we look at as a journal as well as a membership subcommittee member. When we are looking at applications, we often sort of want to see whether the journal has its processes in place. One of the first things that we will look at is what are the guidelines which the journal is putting out there for authors. It's not simply about, that a journal shouldn't simply say that we are putting out, we are following or we are being inspired by COPE guidelines. Is a journal precisely laying out what does authorship mean? What does authorship constitute? Is there somebody on the editorial board which is in charge of looking at research misconduct? Is the copyright information being very clearly put out? The peer review guidelines have to be very, very formally and precisely developed. Is it open access in terms of, is this an open review sort of journal? Are you looking at single anonymized, double anonymized? Each of these has its pros and cons. Each of these, depending on your context, depending on your discipline, depending on the kind of institutional framework you're coming from, you will have to think about which of these to adopt. But it has to be mentioned very precisely. And it's very important to also, of course, then think about processes to identify ethical concerns, because there's a great spurt in applications to COPE, and that is happening because there's a great sort of push in academia, which all of us as journal editors, or I'm a journal editor, I'm also that, I'm a professor at this point. There is a pressure to publish, there is a pressure to put your research out there. And so in that process, the ethics of the publishing industry or the publishing world come under pressure. Journals actually have to develop those processes in which there must be scope for whistleblowers to come in. There must be scope for publications, for post-publication corrections to be published. All of those processes have to be identified very, very clearly on the website when we are sort of putting it out there.
Okay, so can you tell us how journal offices are then meant to customize COPE advice and resources and how they incorporate them into their own guidelines, policies, and processes? So let's use as an example the toolkit area number 2, developing guidelines for reviewers based on COPE Core Practice 9.
It's very important, for example, Trevor, and everybody here to sort of think about what the process consists of. The very
Oh, Anubhav, you've frozen on my screen. Okay, so Anubhav, can you reconnect? And I'll progress to the next slide. So this is about COPE Core Practice 9, that all peer review processes must be transparent. So of course, the membership subcommittee will be testing for this and looking for evidence of sound peer review processes and ethical peer review processes. And there is a list in the toolkit for advising how to develop guidelines for reviewers. And so there is a useful bullet list here of how to use the resources and step by step what to do. So do state on the website what is peer reviewed and what model you use. Anubhav, you're back. You're on mute. So unmute. Okay.
I'm so sorry. Move to a new campus. That's just getting in place. On how to develop guidelines for reviewers, it's very important to sort of think of not just having the same set of people who are doing the review all the time, but to have a diverse group of people who can bring that set of knowledge about your discipline, about your journey into play. Journals need to be able to think of how the peer reviews are selected and framed, how many peer reviewers to have for each and every manuscript, to very clearly define how much time should a peer review take. What we often find odd when we are doing membership applications is that, if some journal will say that the peer review was done in just 2 weeks, let us say, which, given the challenges of academic work today, is very difficult. So, you need to have a clear-cut idea of what a reviewer is supposed to be doing. Often there is a complaint which we have from researchers who are not using English as their primary language, that their research is often rejected because of language issues. And depending on what your journal thinks, this is again something the journals have to think on their own, but that question of language also makes, should your reviewer be looking at a researcher's language? Should your reviewer be looking at the research findings? Is there a combination of both? All of these have to be thought of.
Okay, thank you. And here's a list or some examples of COPE resources, either guidelines, flowcharts. So please use these and incorporate them in your own processes. And for example, we don't say which model of peer review you should use. So again, we give generic descriptive advice, and then it's up to each journal to choose their own mode of peer review, but to explain it transparently to their stakeholders. So the next question is, which categories should people apply for? Because there are 2 categories.
Yeah, so we have largely 2 categories for journal members and publishers. Journal members can be applicants. A journal should have been publishing for a minimum of 12 months at least. Publisher can apply to become a member if they have been publishing if they have at least 5 or more peer-reviewed journals. We also have individual and corporate members for people who are involved in the process of publication of peer-reviewed journals, but who are not necessarily journal editors or publishers. All of these categories are listed very neatly on the website.
Okay, and then there's a note there saying all journals must have been publishing for at least 1 year. And what's the actual application process?
So depending on which category that you're applying to, we have various forms. These forms have also been designed keeping in mind the spirit of the core practices and the principles of transparency. So that if you actually look, and if you want to have a look, you can just go through the form without filling any details. If we give you an idea of what we are looking for when we are assessing membership applications. We are actually, again, trying to think of, are you adapting and applying the core practices and the principles of transparency in terms of, is your editorial board diverse? If you are saying, as Kevin mentioned, if you are an international journal, is your editorial board sufficiently international? If you are a journal doing research which involves human subjects, are you mentioning the research statement? Are you mentioning the consent statements? Is the conflict of interest being mentioned in the sort of papers that you have put out on your website? All of these are sort of questions that you will see in the membership form, which we look out for when we are assessing the applications.
And it's slightly different for publisher members who publish more than 5 journals.
Yes. So for that, we are of course trying to look at the structure of the organization also, because it's not just one single unit, but it's also, you know, a sort of company which is looking after various kinds of journals. So there is the focus is to think of what is the corpus of the publication that is being put out by the applicant, and the structure of how that publisher is managing that process.
Right. And so there's an Excel sheet that you have to fill in for publisher members. And then there's an FAQ site as well.
Yeah. FAQs are actually quite comprehensive.
Right. Yeah. And then there's also a price list, isn't there?
Yes. There are different kinds of prices across the sort of checklist. So for journals, there will be something like, I believe it's around £200 per year. For publisher members is something like, there are different kinds of prices depending on your membership category. It's important to remember that we are an organization which is here to encourage and educate, so that if they are discounts, they are reduced prices if you belong to lower income countries and backgrounds. So that is also kept in mind when designing the membership fee.
Okay, oh good. So discounts and waivers are available. So what happens after a potential applicant submits their application form?
There's a two-stage process. Broadly speaking, the applications are triaged by one of the group staff, and they have a look at whether the application is conforming to all the basic benchmarks that we are interested in. Around 36% of all applications are rejected at this stage. So it's really very important to keep in mind that when you are designing your journal, especially if you're a new applicant who's looking to become a member of COPE, when you're designing your website, when you're designing the processes in your journal, please do have a look at the principles of transparency and the core practices. That is actually the first stage when a lot of the applications are eliminated. And once that has done, it goes on to the membership subcommittee. It has a whole bunch of people from the council. Around 52% of all applications submitted over the past few years were actually accepted by membership after coming to us from the initial triage. So we do try to sort of, even if we are not able to accept an application, we do always try and give encouraging feedback and sort of give suggestions on how you can improve the journal so that you can come back after a year and apply again.
And you actually do, I remember when I was on the committee, we actually do check sample papers, sample articles from the journal to make sure that it's within the aims and scope that's claimed. They contain certain declarations like conflicts of interest statements, ethics statements, even sometimes checking for self-citation rates to see if authors are excessively citing themselves or the journal is citing itself. Do you still do that?
Yeah. I mean, personally, I think it takes me around 4 to 5 hours per journal application because there's just so many things to check. And, we will at least open 5 to 6 issues even if it's a new journal, if it's been publishing for, let's say it's a half-yearly journal which has been publishing for the past 5 years, we will open up at least 5 to 6 issues, and each per issue we will open up at least 3 to 4 articles and try and have a look at the ethics statement, try and see if there is a conflict of interest statement, check if the author's contribution sort of percentage is very defined. As per the discipline, some disciplines, for example, in my own discipline, we don't have the habit of determining what is the percentage of authorship. But in many other disciplines we do. And so at the membership level, we also try and keep that in mind. There's a whole bunch of things that we check at that stage.
Now, I have a question. If you decide to reject an applicant, but you give a list of kind of like peer review comments, how they can improve and apply next time, how long do they have to wait before reapplying?
It's a year.
A year,
they have
okay.
To wait for it. Yeah.
Okay. And do you have final tips and advice for applying?
It's again, it just boils down to following the core practices and the principles of transparency. you have to really ensure that your application is complete and all the information that they're asking for is supplied. I've come across applications where the editorial board's members' CVs were not updated. So, that becomes a problem. The website is really now a matter of record in the times we live. So the website must be professionally put out. All the URLs that you provide in the application must be correct and must link out to the right page. Please
so all the links have to work as well then?
Yes, all the links have to work. And please do not just copy paste. So many of the applications that we look at say that they are motivated or they are informed or they are guided by code practices and policies, but that is it. Just saying that or even just copying out the titles of the code practices does not really help. We do actually check if the processes defined by the editorial board for the reviewers, for the authors are actually being followed out. And please also do not use the same URL on the homepage URL for each required guideline. So if there is a page which goes to research misconduct, it should go to research misconduct, and the page for conflict of interest should not be the same as research misconduct. This should not be the same as the homepage of it.
Right. Okay, good. So there's some useful tips for potential applicants, and please do carefully assemble your submission package and do good luck for those submitting applications in the coming few months. And now we come to the next part of the webinar for us to put into practice some of those things. So as Anubhav said, we don't want to just see statements on their own. We look for proof that you're living and breathing publication ethics. And so let's put into practice the core practices and the principles of transparency. Let's see how you'll do. This is an anonymous quiz. So a poll window will pop up and it will give you multiple choice ABC. So just choose which you think is the best answer, the best response to the situation. So it's anonymous. We won't see your answers, but we'll look at the overall advice. So Anubhav will introduce the cases and then and he'll summarize the responses from the audience, and then I'll comment on the responses and highlight relevant COPE resources. So the first case is an editor as an author in their own journal. So Anubhav, here's the case.
Yes. So let us say that there's an editor of a specialized journal who is also leading researcher in a certain topic. That editor wants to publish their work, and that their journal is apparently the only suitable one across the world for this. The editor would have a conflict of interest submitting to their own journal and personally selecting 2 external peer reviewers. Now, can editors publish in their own journal? What do you all think? One option is no, because the peer review will be biased because of a conflict of interest. The second option is yes, but an associate editor should independently handle the peer review process. The third option is yes, but remove the author names before the peer review. What do you all think? You can have your responses now.
So Alyssa will activate the poll window. So here's the poll window.
It's active now, and we're looking to have your responses. A lot of responses going to B. Around 88% people responding for B. 7% like not for A, 10% for C. B is getting most of the responses. You're still waiting for around 100 applicants to respond. Here's your chance. There is, I think, around 15 more seconds for the participants to respond now. Inching close to around 200 responses. And 75% of the participants are going for B here. Okay. Should we share the results now?
Mhm.
So around 13% of the participants have voted for A, 75% have voted for B, and 12% have voted for C. Okay, what do you think? What is the most appropriate answer?
Thank you, Annabeth. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. And so most chose B, but as you'll see, actually, some of these are a bit tricky. So let's go through the answers. So a few of you did choose A, and I do know some journals in their guidelines are very strict and do not allow editors and editorial board members to submit to their own journal. So it is possible that some journals don't allow it because it's perceived as having a conflict of interest. And that's something that the membership subcommittee look for. For example, the proportion of papers written by the chief editor. It'd be obvious if all the papers are written by your own staff. So A is possible, but also many journals do allow it, but control the conflict of interest or minimize it. So it is possible to publish in your own journal, but there have to be special rules around it. So one of these is B. So people who chose B, well done. This is the clearly an okay answer. So the journal editor who is an author cannot be involved in their own peer review process for their own paper, including choosing external peer reviewers. So the whole process would be biased, whether really or subconsciously. So there has to be a special process in place, and declare what the process is in your journal guidelines, and also set it as official policy. And for readers who might notice the same thing, they'll see that the author list contains many editorial board members. So for readers, it's best to also put a statement in the article of what happened in the peer review process. So the peer review process is seen as completely sacred in publishing. So C, just removing the names, so single, double, anonymized, is not enough, because the chief editor or the editor who's an author would have still chosen the peer reviewers. So the editor involved should not be choosing the peer reviewers and just removing the names, thinking that's enough. So on its own, C will not solve the problem. So let's look at the COPE guidance. The principles of transparency number 8, new yellow part, it did say if an article's peer review is an exception to the usual policy, the article should state what review it did receive. And then there is a document from COPE, a short guide to ethical editing for new editors. And there it says, can editors publish in their own journal? While you should not be denied the ability to publish, you have to take extra precautions. For example, handling submissions from editors or editorial board members. You must have a special procedure for handling submissions to ensure that the peer review is handled independently of the author editor, i.e. the editor who is the author. So, and it says, we recommend that you describe the process in the journal guidelines, but also in the article itself. And here's an example from a Taylor and Francis journal. So they've put in their guidelines, the editor must delegate responsibility of peer review and the editorial decision process of any of their own work submitted to the journal, apart from editorials from the journal. They have to give it to another suitable editor. And then here's an example from a Wiley journal, an actual article saying what happened in peer review. So one of the authors is on the editorial board, so they're an assistant editor. So it says they did not participate in the peer review process other than as an author, and the authors declare no other conflicts of interest. So that's something to do in the actual article. Okay, so that was an easy one. Number 2, possible salami publication. Here's the next case.
Salami publications are unfortunately becoming very, very common instances in academia. So here's a case. A peer reviewer notices that there's some data in a submitted paper, which has been described before, and the method is unclear. The authors say that another journal told them to divide their last study into 4 papers, and all are cross-referenced. The authors have tried to clarify in a revision that this paper has a different hypothesis and method. The original peer reviewer checks the revision and recommends rejection because 2/3 of the data were described before and the number of participants is unclear. What should the journal editor do? Option 1, reject. This is a Kempis Salami publication. Option 2, reject. This is a Kempis redundant or duplicate publication. And C, accept if fully transparent about partial redundancy. At the point now, the poll has been opened. We're looking for your responses. I'm just going to match between A and B as of now. More people are going towards B. Still waiting for around 100 participants to respond. We have 10 more seconds for people who haven't responded yet. Okay, I think we can close the poll now. Share the results. So clever, around 27% of the participants have gone for A, 45% have gone for B, and 27% have gone for C.
Okay, thank you, Anubhav. Thank you, everyone. So there's about half have chosen B, reject, because it's redundant, and the other half is split between reject because it's salami and accept if they are transparent. So let's have a look at the answers and what Cope says about this. So A, it's attempted salami. Now the definitions are not very clear cut, but basically salami, for cutting up a study into many smaller studies, it's very difficult to detect in submissions. Usually it's too late. After it's been published, then it's more clear because you can compare published studies. So yes, some journals might automatically reject if they detect anything that might resemble salami, but also for the definition, some use a definition of the same study question and same research question, same population, even the same methods, but only if then different papers are divided by the outcomes. So for example, doing a study in a school, and even if it's an education study in a school, but reporting only the results for the girls in one paper, and then for the boys in another paper, and then the second paper refers to the first paper to compare the girls versus boys, rather than having it in just one complete study. So that will be an obvious example. But in this case, the question did say it was a different hypothesis and a different method. So it could be argued it's not quite the same as the definition for salami. But B, is it redundant because there's material that's repeated? And I've put a question mark here because it's only if it's exactly the same paper or very nearly the same paper. So it's duplicate publication. And again, the definitions aren't quite clear cut. If it's the same paper, the same question, the same data, even the same findings and conclusions, then it's like publishing the same paper twice. In this case, again, the case says it's a different hypothesis, different method, and but we don't know why 2/3 of the data are overlapping, and there hasn't been an effort to try to hide it. So there was cross-referencing to the earlier papers. So again, it might not be classed as duplicate publication. So C is the best answer because if the authors are very clear about what is overlapping, why they've repeated some of the data, exactly what is the research question that's new, what is the method that's new, and who the participants are, and they have copyright permission in case the first published paper is copyrighted by the publisher, then it should be possible to publish it. And the readers will not be misled thinking that it's a unique study when some of the data have already been published. So as long as it's transparent and it's clear and worth publishing, so this is a judgment call for the editor and the editorial board. So it's a gray area, and you'll have to decide, is there enough new information to make this study worthy of adding to the literature? So let's have a look at some suggested definitions. So there was a case discussion on the website that said, gave some definitions. So in this case, it's not plagiarism because that's taking or using or presenting other people's ideas or data or results or writings and inventions without giving due or appropriate credit to the originator. It could be self-plagiarism or unacceptable text recycling, which is reusing your own previous work without being transparent about it or without appropriately referencing or quoting from the original. But we saw that in this case, the authors were transparent. The next definition is for redundant or duplicate publication, which is the publication or attempted publication of a whole or substantial parts of a work, data, or analysis that have already been published or have been submitted elsewhere without transparency or appropriate declaration or referencing. So the point here is that the authors try to hide that they've already published it. Again, in this case, the authors were transparent that there was some overlap. Now, note that some journals do allow so-called pre-publication. So conference abstracts and posters is universally allowed, that you can go to conferences and present the work in advance of submission to a journal. And then it depends on the journal for whether they accept work that was presented as a conference paper or as a public preprint on a preprint server site such as arXiv or bioRxiv or medRxiv. So it's papers that have not yet been submitted or have been submitted, but not peer-reviewed and not accepted. So the early versions, sometimes called working papers, can be on a preprint server, but different journals have different rules. And then the next definition is for salami or segmented, fragmented, or fragmentary publication, which is publishing one study as multiple articles. And as we said, it could be with the same research questions, same research methods and population. Possibly it includes text or data recycling. So there's some self-plagiarism involved, word for word, but with just enough new data presented in each new paper. So we call that a minimal or minimum or smallest or least publishable unit. So unfortunately it happens because people are aiming for quantity over quality. But note that, some journals do allow segmentation specifically. So special situations, some journals allow registered reports for example, human clinical trials where you will publish the protocol first before publishing the results. That's to discourage people manipulating the data later on. Or you can actually publish a protocol of not necessarily a human study. So even chemistry, physics papers, you can publish the protocol as an article itself. Then for human studies, for a very large cohort-based study, the BMJ allows you to publish a cohort profile before publishing the full paper. And there are now data articles and even data journals where you can publish a paper introducing a whole data set, but it doesn't have the results and the discussion that belongs to another paper. So this kind of segmentation is allowed if the journal allows it and then there are special rules. But this is different from salami slicing or salami publication. So there is a COPE flowchart of plagiarism in the submitted article. So those definitions overlap a little bit. So in our case that we're discussing now, it could be seen as redundant because there were 2/3 overlapping data. It could be self-plagiarism if they use their own text word for word. So in the plagiarism flowchart, it does say there's a special case of self-plagiarism. So this is redundancy, i.e. copying from the author's own work, and it says, see the redundancy flowchart. So let's go to the redundancy flowchart in a submitted manuscript, and we'll see that minor overlaps need to have relevant citations, or the overlapping material can be removed. For major overlaps, if the authors admit guilt or cannot give a satisfactory reply, the paper gets rejected, and even the institution could get informed because it's a form of misconduct. And if the overlap is a mistake, for example, made by inexperienced authors, the paper could be rejected or revised, such as by removing the redundant material, by adding citations and explanations of the overlap, or even by combining overlapping papers into a larger and more meaningful paper. There's also a flowchart for suspected redundant publication in a published article, so it's already been published, and minor overlaps can be corrected by adding citations and explanations, and articles showing major overlaps need to be corrected or retracted. And again, the author's institutions can be informed to prevent this from happening in the future. And COPE Core Practice 7 does say what constitutes plagiarism and redundant or overlapping publication should be specified. So are conference abstracts allowed? Are preprints allowed as pre-publication? And in the extreme case that the same article is repeated, so that really is duplicate publishing, then the retraction guidelines say that the journal that published first may issue a notice of redundant publication, and then later versions of that article, the journals that subsequently publish a redundant article, they should retract it and state the reason for retraction. And to keep content original, so journals can have clear journal guidelines for authors about what is plagiarism, what's text recycling, what is allowed and not, what is redundancy, and what's allowed as pre-publication, including preprints on a preprint server. And journals can join a database called Sherpa Romeo, which has a comprehensive list of which journals allow what for copyright permissions, for posting as a preprint or not. So do have a look at Sherpa Romeo. It's best to have a screening procedure in place to check for text similarity at both submission and resubmission, because you don't know what authors have added after revisions. And you can ask authors to declare originality and declare and submit even similar works published or already submitted to check that there's no salami or duplicate publication. And here's an example from the journal Nature. It says copies of any papers containing related work should be included with the submission as supplementary information. And preprints don't count as prior publication. And other cases I've said include abstracts in conference proceedings, conference posters, and sometimes conference papers. So be clear in your journal guidelines. Okay, so here's the third case of possible lack of participants' consent.
Thank you, Trevor. So this is about, let us say a journal receives a manuscript reporting on volunteers having received experimental hospital treatment. The treatment was given under supervision in intensive care unit in the case of serious side effects. The journal submission does not mention the participant giving informed consent or the researchers obtaining ethics committee approval. What should the editor do next in this case? Option A, proceed with peer review because this was emergency care. Option B, ask the authors about informed consent and ethics committee approval. Option C, suspend review and ask the author's institution to follow up. Have the poll now. Poll is up for your responses. Now 90% of the participants going for B right now. Still have about 100 participants to respond. 20 seconds left. Still 90% for B. Okay, I think we can close the poll now. The results are 2% for A, 7% for C, and 90% for B.
Thank you, Anubhav. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. And most chose B. So let's have a look at the commentary. So participant consent and ethics approval is probably still needed for emergency care. So that's why well done for most of you not choosing A. If it could even be classed as experimental research, or because it's emergency doesn't mean you don't need patient consent and ethics approval. If it's a human study, researchers still need ethics board or IRB, Institutional Review Board approval, or their formal waiver of approval. So only the board can say that you don't need ethics approval or that you don't need participant consent. So it's good to bear in mind there are 3 types of participant consent for human studies. One is to actually take part in a study and receive treatment. The second one is to publish the paper that may or may not have identifying figures and illustrations. And the third is to share data publicly, anonymized, but it's best to have patient consent to be able to do that. B, most of you chose, is correct. So there is a COPE flowchart on suspected ethical issues in submitted manuscripts. And the first line of action is to ask the authors to explain. And did they have a waiver, for example? They just forgot to mention that they applied formally to an ethics board and the ethics board gave them a waiver that they didn't need permission. So it just could be a mistake. And then C, not many people chose, but C is also possible because if the response to B is not satisfactory, then you can go to C and inform the institutions and involve them. So both B and C could be correct. And let's have a look at the relevant flowchart dealing with suspected ethics issues in a submitted manuscript. And we'll zoom in. And first it says request the author to supply relevant details. And if it's not satisfactory, then forward the concerns to the employer or the institution. So the ethics toolkit, the area number 3, which was to develop processes to identify ethical concerns, did include ethical oversight, which is linked to COPE Core Practice 6. You need policies on consent to publication and conduct of research using human subjects. And the toolkit says that journals need to check articles for research ethics and have processes for handling potential breaches of informed consent and ethics approval, and journals need to prevent things like plagiarism, data fabrication and falsification, peer review, manipulation, citation manipulation, and authorship misconduct. And the Elsevier journal guidelines here do talk about patient consent and IRB, Institutional Review Board, permission, and they actually ask you to submit the permission letter as part of the submission package. So that's something that your journals can do. And an example within an article is in the author disclosure statements at the end to actually include a statement about ethical approvals with the number, the permission letter number, approval number as well, just like a grant number. The ICMJE, International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, is not just for medical journals, so any human studies, including social sciences journals, can use these guidelines. So they have comprehensive advice on research and publication ethics, especially involving humans. And then there's also advice in the GPP, or Good Publication Practice Guidelines for Human and Animal Research, that's sponsored by companies and industry and pharmaceutical companies, because there are even more special considerations there. So I co-authored these GPP T22 guidelines. So here's the final case, number 4, an authorship dispute case.
Thank you, Trevor. So authorship dispute again become very, very common as cases. A retired professor claims that they should have been included as an author on 2 published articles in the journal. The editor discovered that the professor was involved in the early stage of book studies and was named as an author but was removed from the final draft by the same co-author. After much effort and involvement of the institution, the editor decided to correct both articles by adding the author, but both the authors remain unhappy. How can the editor handle future author disputes? Option A, ask authors to give fair contributions so the editor can decide. Setting option B, retract the articles. Option C, require authors or the institutions to decide. Have the poll now. Most of the participants going to option number A right now, although option C is also catching up. This is again one of those tricky questions and cases which Trevor has put up for us. We still have around 10 seconds left. Around 50 participants can answer. All right, we can close the poll now. And the results are 60% have gone for option A, 4% for B, and 36% for C.
Thank you, Anubhav, and thank you, everyone. So that was the final quiz. So nearly 2/3 chose A. Let's have a look. So A is possible, but it's not enough just asking authors to declare who did what. The journal still needs to clarify what types of activity are classed as authorship. So A is okay. It's better to be transparent and ask the authors to list who did what, but then the journal has to do some extra work to clarify the authorship criteria, and it could also require the authors to declare actually within the paper, within the article, who did what, so the readers can also know. B, actually, even though not many people chose, B is possible. So if the content's okay, but there's a dispute about who is an author and who should be acknowledged, it normally wouldn't result in retraction. But if there's a IP, intellectual property problem, or plagiarism case that turns into a legal case, then retraction is possible. And retraction is also possible if the authorship problem turns out to be use of a paper mill. So it's creating a fake paper or selling authorships for someone not involved in the research, but it could even be fake research. So that could be retracted. So an authorship dispute, it could be a telltale sign of something more serious. And then C is the best answer here, because you can follow the COPE flowcharts. The advice COPE always gives is please refer authorship dispute cases to the authors themselves for them to decide and argue who is an author. And then if they can't decide, you involve the institution. So usually the journal and editorial board can't do much for who said who was doing what. So you have to rely on the authors themselves. But of course, you can collect the forms and make sure the declarations are present and compare them against the criteria for authorship. So here's a relevant COPE flowchart. Request to add an author after publication, and it says you have to get the written agreement from all authors, or else if they still can't decide, you have to refer the case to the institution. So C was correct as well. Here's an infographic, how to recognize potential authorship problems. So you can just search for that in the COPE website. And then there's a flowchart for ghost, guest, or gift. So I should explain. So you have to check for submitted papers if there are ghost authors. So those are researchers who've been omitted from the author list, or guest or gift authors who have been added to the author list, but they don't deserve authorship. So here's a flowchart again to try to manage possible cases of ghost, guest, or gift authors. And activity area number 1 in the toolkit was for author guidelines. So who contributed to the work and in what capacity, and you need to manage potential disputes. And relevant considerations for policies are having a clear definition of authorship criteria, requiring authors to declare contributions in the submission letter and in the article, and having processes to handle author disputes, such as using the flowcharts that we just saw. For example, the Oxford University Press publisher guidelines on authorship use the ICMJE criteria that we saw before, and this OUP article requires an author declaration inside the article showing the contributions of each author. Now, more and more journals are using the credit system, or the contributor roles taxonomy, to itemize who did what. So there are 14 activities, but as shown by this policy of Sage, the publisher Sage, their journals still need to state which specific credits activities count as authorship. So the combination of which of the credit items count could be journal specific. And this Sage journal declares the credit activities at the end of the article, and its author guidelines also remind authors about honesty in the author list, as well as declaring possibly similar papers to avoid redundant publication. So very clear author guidelines are very important. And finally, publication ethics is always evolving, so do check COPE and update your journal guidance as needed, because COPE recently issued this position statement that generative AI, such as ChatGPT, cannot be an author. Only humans can be authors, and authors need to declare if and how any generative AI was used, including in the writing stage and content development, but usually it's okay for language editing only. So that brings us to the end of the case studies and the main part of the webinar, and I hope you found it useful. And now I invite you to please type your questions in the Zoom Q&A text box, and we'll go to those now. So the first question, someone asks, they have a question about authors who want to remove authorship after the co-authors do not respond for any required information, for example, the forms and signatures, even after a long time and having contacted their offices. So Anubhav, have you come across this in your journal? So I think this is a case where the co-authors aren't responding, or the authors aren't responding, and the co-authors can't find the author either. How do you manage a conflict?
In our journal, what we have largely done is that we will give a certain time frame, whatever that time frame may be, and then if the co-authors do respond within that time frame, then that is very fine. And if they do not, then that gets put on the record that they have not responded. However, if there's a substantial contribution which the co-author has made, which is not responding now, we still encourage the authors to actually go and get it, perhaps contact the institution and find a way of resolving that, because it's not such a black and white thing. Just because they're not responding, there could be some reason why they're not going to respond.
Yes, I'd agree. So you would have to go to ask the institution to help, and there's not much a journal can do in that case. I don't know whether some journals would go as far as submitting a expression of concern to say that there's an authorship dispute going on, but at least the content of the paper is still intact. So, I mean, that could be an extreme case to let the readers know, and then issue a correction later on if needed. There is a question which says, can we use a standardized process flow? I think that means like a flow chart to address all types of ethical misconduct. I think there are so many types of ethical misconduct under the sun, under the moon, that we do need different flow charts. And as we've seen, there are many flow charts for different situations. So please do look at the COPE website.
Our flow charts are not that complicated. You know, we all wish for life to be simple, but the flow charts are not that complicated.
I think the COPE staff did think maybe it's time to do a kind of an input, an AI version or some kind of algorithm. So you can input your specific cases and it will pop up with the most relevant flowcharts. That's on our wish list. Another question, can a new journal write an ethical reviewer author guidelines link in his guidelines before applying? So can a journal create its own ethics guidelines before applying for COPE indexing? Well, I think that's what we've been saying, is you need to have guidelines for all those different types of situations, including misconduct, but also preventing misconduct. But it's not just prevention and treatment. We also want positive guidelines. So guidelines that create a positive publishing culture and for ethical publishing. So it's not all negative. So yes, you actually do need all those guidelines in place. So do write them, but also live and breathe them. Show evidence that you do follow ethical guidelines for publishing before you submit to COPE application.
And next is
yeah, I think this is a potential citation manipulation one. So Anubhav, can we ask authors, so can reviewers and editors ask to include specific references? What would you say to that?
Questions are
would you allow your editors and reviewers to ask for references to be included if there's a missing reference? Or have you frozen, Anubhav? Okay.
Look, I'm still here, but which question are we on?
I think it just got removed. So do you allow reviewers and editors to ask for specific references if they're missing?
We will cross-check. So let's say if the paper mentions a certain reference which is not in the list of references, you would certainly go back and ask the author to sort of provide that reference.
Yeah, it's got to be a genuine academic
Yeah.
reason. Oh, here's a question which is
about transparency and AI.
Yeah, I just had it and it disappeared. It was what percentage of AI use is possible? That's like the question, what percentage of plagiarism is allowed? And we say no percentage for plagiarism. You shouldn't plagiarize. For AI, you can't put a percentage on what is allowed or not, but it's the purpose. So of course you can't use it to generate your data. You can't use it to generate the key figures that you're using or to create your content, but we say language editing is possible. I know some journals might be that strict to say, please even declare if you use it for language editing. And then other journals that allow, for example, Grammarly, use of Grammarly, purely for the language. And maybe you have to include the prompts you use to prove that you only used it for language editing, but not content creation. So I think it's an issue that's evolving, but there won't probably be a percentage you're allowed or not allowed.
And next is, what is the core policy regarding the inclusion of references in the anti-plagiarism system check for the papers accepted for publication? This is similar to what we've been talking about here, right?
I don't know which question you're on because these are out of order.
Yeah.
Could you answer that one?
Yeah. The core policy regarding sorry, the questions are what is the core policy regarding the inclusion of references in the anti-plagiarism system? We are more concerned about excessive self-citation. So if there is a lot of self-citation, then that makes the paper suspect. These are policies which the journals have to really then evolve for themselves, keeping in mind the code practices and the principle of transparency. Excessive self-citation is never a good idea.
Well, I think it's a technical point. So yes, you can. You should discount the references in plagiarism text matching software. So if it becomes too sensitive, then it looks like a big percentage because it's actually including the wording of the references. So you should remove that bit when you're telling the software what to look for.
Oh, it's that. So yeah, the software has to look at the paper, not the references per se.
So someone's asking for guidance on ethical permission waiver for retrospective studies of or secondary data analyses, because the patients were not aware of how their data would be used or something like that. So there's going to be some cases where it depends on the wording of the consent. So if the consent is that you're allowing your data to be used for both primary analysis and secondary analysis, then that should be okay. But then there are large-scale studies also that, again, you'll have to look at the small print of the participant consent. So large cross-sectional services, submissions or papers, or even longitudinal data, some census data, for example, surveys, government surveys, or really, really large cohort studies like the Framingham Heart study. Those data will be made available for other researchers to use. And so those will be secondary analyses. So it depends on what the data were collected for and what the participants were told at the time of collection. But those very large data sets, there's many groups that do secondary analyses on them. And they don't need separately to get patient consent each time.
There's a question here, Trevor, on AI again. Is there COPE guidance in place or being planned on how to handle manuscripts with undeclared AI-generated text and or figures. This is a tricky one. What we've been talking about. Can you see the question? It's at the top.
Yeah.
How to handle. So we just put out the position statement on AI, in which
at the moment now, because it's a fast evolving area, each journal needs to create its own policy for what you allow or don't allow. So I don't think you could be very strict and not allow it at all. It's up to you, but make sure the policy is transparent. And then say whether you do allow AI in your illustrations or not, or in the literature review, and then you have to add all the extra caveats that it's the responsibility of the authors to check whatever came out of as the output. So you can either be strict or you can allow it, but with caveats. And then ask authors to declare exactly what they did, because it's just like a method or technique or tool. You have to explain it in your methods section or in your declaration section somewhere. And some journals might even say you're not allowed to cite material produced by AI because it wasn't it's not a publication, or it's not something that's produced by a human. So different journals will have different things at this stage. We're still at an early stage of its use within publications. So yeah, at the moment it's declare everything, to be better safe than sorry.
I see a question which is asking for advice for an editor whose application has been rejected before. If your application has been rejected before, you will most probably have received fairly constructive feedback on why your application has been rejected. And it would be best to sort of look into those processes which we found lacking in your application and rectify it. As we've been trying to say that we do actually want more and more people to come on board share the principles that we believe in. So we do encourage people to sort of look into those processes which may be lacking and apply it.
Someone's asked an interesting question. Is it ethical to publish a fictional case study? Then I would say it's not a case study then. So definitely don't publish it in the case report section. I don't think any journal will allow you to do that. If you want to have an educational piece, you'll have to explain this clearly in your submission letter, that it's an educational hypothetical article about a fictional case report, if it has any educational value. Yes, because exactly as the question said, it might end up distorting the literature, just like redundant publications repeating the data all the time. It will distort the meta-analyses in the future. So I would treat that as an educational paper.
There's another question. If an institute does not have any ethical body or ethics body to approve the research, then how can researchers go ahead with their papers? And I believe this is an unfortunately common problem for many researchers from Asia. At least many institutions do not have IRPs or ethics bodies. It would still be useful to constitute something, if not at the institutional level, but at least at a departmental level. Most researchers who are working as within universities, at least at a departmental level, it would be good to have a committee, and then at least that is the basis which can guarantee a certain amount of advisory benchmarking, which can then help you to go ahead with your research.
Yes, I think sometimes you can ask a neighboring other type of institution, like a hospital. So there might be a hospital board or district that has their own associated ethics board that you can ask. And there are actually also some outsourced companies, some third parties that exist. But I know there's also there is a COPE guidance on one of the COPE resources. So sometimes in extreme cases, if there was no ethics board available and you didn't know whether there's ethics board approval, the journal itself would have to, again, make a judgment call. The editors have to decide, was it done ethically? And then you'll have to add a note at the end that there was no ethics board available, but whether the peer reviewers and the editors consider the research to have been ethically done. So there are sometimes gray areas like that.
Is it ethical to have articles published in a journal without knowing the exact proportion of content generated by AI? Seem to be coming back to the very
again, if you're going to be if you're going to be transparent, then you'd have to yourself specify which parts had AI assistance and which parts you're reporting, and you declare that the authors have full control. So in declaring what you used and the prompts and sample outputs, it's a supplementary information that would inform the editors and the readers what proportion, because it's not just the proportion as a number. If you used AI to create data and report results, it's a qualitative thing. It might be a small percentage, but your whole conclusion relies on something made by AI, which is not ethical. So if you're pretending that that's genuine patient data. So I think it's not just a simple quantitative proportion thing. Someone's asked about AI in writing. So again, writing can be the content generation and literature review and text generation, or it could just be language polishing. So I think it's okay for language polishing, but if anything more than that, you would have to, again, declare it and be transparent in your cover letter and also in the article itself.
There's a question about manuscripts have extensive methods. I'm guessing there might be a manuscript which have extensive methodology that may have been previously published but lack any references. Should this be considered a kind of plagiarism? I will go with almost yes. That a research paper without any references is always a good, or to me, both as a journal editor as well as a researcher. So I will be very wary of such a paper.
Yeah, I agree. I think if it's a well-known method, you would cite the paper, and that's also a way for readers to go back to that method. And if you made modifications, then of course you can describe the modifications in detail, but the method came from somewhere first. And even if it's your own method that you've described before, it's best to cite it so that people can go back to the original source and you don't have to repeat all the methods again. Unless it's your own new method in that current paper, so yeah, usually there would be a source of it. And even sometimes you might have to link to manufacturer's details or well-known protocol books. Or I said before, there are protocol papers, protocol articles, exactly for transparency, for people to find the protocols. So there are many ways to do it. So you want your work to be reproducible and for people to find the protocol. Capacity building for reviewers and editors. We do have e-learning for members. So we have e-learning course, and we have regular forum and seminars for professionals to keep up to date. So we do, and we are expanding this area for education and capacity building for editors, reviewers, editorial boards, and editing staff. I think we're coming to close to the end, so we might, if you can pick out any final questions, Anubhav, that pop out at you.
I think I can see a question which has three modes, which is some authors submit papers at 2 journals at the same time, and then they withdraw the paper from one journal after being accepted by another. How to deal with this? Would you like to answer that, Trevor?
Well, it's seen as multiple submissions, so it's still misconduct, and you'd have to tell them off and inform their institution if it's systematic, and it happens a lot, because it's a waste of resources, and there's a danger of duplicate publication if 2 or more journals publish the same thing. So it's just not a good practice. So again, you just have to inform in a stern way, inform the authors, inform their institution to try to discourage it.
Yeah, it's like a basic good practice on your journals to say that the submissions must be original and must not be submitted anywhere else. And if you find that this is happening, then you should, of course, bring it to the institution.
And there's another question similar to that. It's what if the authors want to withdraw their submission while it's still in review? Hopefully it's not because it's a duplicate submission or concurrent submission, but you'd have to look at the small print of your author fees. Sometimes some journals do impose a submission fee for peer review to pay for that. So then that would be lost then. But then the other fee for article processing, sometimes it says only if the article has been accepted do they then charge the fee. So it depends on what stage of the process the fee is charged to try to discourage that practice. But actually, at the end of the day, you can't say no if an author wants to withdraw during submission or during review. Okay, any more with multiple ones? I think that's it. So for the other ones, we'll try to maybe answer and make the answers available, but we have gone over the hour. So thank you everyone for your interesting questions. I hope that we've answered most of them. The answers have been useful. So that's all we have time for now. So thank you for joining this webinar, and do look out for the questionnaire feedback form that will be emailed after this meeting. And special thanks to my co-host Anubhav and the amazing COPE team behind the scenes for organizing and running this webinar. And good luck to those of you who may be applying or reapplying for COPE membership in the future. And you can download the ethics toolkit and the other resources from COPE from the COPE website. Thank you again for joining this session, and we look forward to connecting with you again in future COPE webinars. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Goodbye.